the strategy behind never needing to explain. Explanation feels harmless, reasonable, even responsible. But at the highest levels of power, explanation is treated as a liability. In the modern world, everything demands justification. Decisions are expected to come with statements. Actions are expected to come with reasons. Silence is interpreted as weakness or guilt. Yet among elite sheiks, explanation is avoided deliberately, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying anything collapses leverage. To understand why this matters today, we need to examine what explanation actually does. It clarifies intent, it reveals priorities, and most importantly, it fixes position. The moment you explain, you narrow your future. Each reason becomes a reference point. Each justification becomes a constraint. Each clarification becomes something others can argue against. The sheiks watched how leaders lost control, not through bad decisions, but through over-explaining good ones. They saw how explanations invited debate. Debate invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited interference. So a different strategy emerged. Instead of explaining actions, they allowed actions to arrive fully formed. Instead of defending decisions, they let outcomes redefine the conversation. This felt uncomfortable to observers. Silence created speculation. Speculation created pressure. But pressure only works when it accelerates response. And response was exactly what the strategy denied. Never explaining does not mean doing nothing. It means acting without narration, moving without framing, letting results stand without interpretation. This is where power separates itself from accountability theater, because explanation does not increase trust. It increases expectation. And expectation is what power learns to avoid. This is the opening insight. The strongest positions are not defended. They are occupied. And once occupied long enough, they no longer require explanation at all. But this strategy carries risk. Silence can be misread. Absence can be challenged. And refusal to explain can provoke escalation. What happens next reveals why never needing to explain is not arrogance. It is architecture. The refusal to explain does not begin as defiance, but as discipline. Because once power understands how quickly explanations become liabilities, it learns that every word spoken voluntarily transfers a piece of control to whoever is listening. Explanation creates an asymmetry that is rarely acknowledged. The explainer becomes reactive. The audience becomes evaluative. And evaluation invites judgment. The sheiks recognize that the moment a decision is explained, it enters a public arena where it can be reframed, dissected, misunderstood, and ultimately used against the one who made it. Each explanation narrows interpretation. Each clarification reduces ambiguity. And ambiguity at the highest level is protection. By explaining, power teaches others how to challenge it. It reveals the logic behind moves. It exposes thresholds. It shows where pressure might work next time. This is why explanation feels responsible but functions as surrender. Instead of explaining intent, the sheiks allowed patterns to speak slowly. Outcomes accumulated. Consistency replaced commentary. Presence replaced persuasion. Silence frustrated observers. Without words to respond to, criticism lost shape. Without reasons to debate, opposition lacked focus. This was not avoidance. It was denial of terrain. Explanations create arenas. They give critics a stage. They set terms for disagreement. By never explaining, power refused to provide the battlefield. This forced attention to shift away from justification and toward results. And results are harder to argue with. Over time, this strategy reshaped expectations. People stopped waiting for explanations. They adjusted to outcomes instead. This adjustment is subtle but decisive. When explanation disappears, timelines stretch, pressure loses rhythm, urgency evaporates, power regains tempo. But this approach demanded patience. Silence invites speculation. Speculation can spiral into narrative. The sheiks accepted this cost knowingly. They understood that narratives without confirmation burn quickly. They collapse under their own weight. By the time explanations were demanded loudly, outcomes were already locked. The conversation arrived late. This is the hidden advantage. Never explaining does not eliminate accountability. It postpones it until it no longer matters. And that postponement preserves autonomy. But silence cannot remain passive. It must be paired with unmistakable movement, because when power refuses to explain, but also fails to act, silence becomes absence, and absence invites challenge. The next phase would test whether explanation could be permanently replaced by structure alone. The conflict emerges when silence is no longer interpreted as discipline, but begins to be framed as avoidance. Because an environment's addicted to constant explanation, the refusal to narrate intent is often mistaken for weakness rather than control. Pressure intensifies at this stage. Institutions demand clarification. Audiences demand transparency. Opponents demand justification. And each demand carries the same underlying goal: to force power into language, to anchor it to a position, to make it predictable. The sheiks understood that this moment was inevitable. Silence can deny terrain only for so long before others attempt to create it themselves. Narratives begin forming without permission. Assumptions harden into conclusions. Speculation fills the vacuum left by explanation. This is where many forms of power collapse. They respond too early. They explain too much. They try to correct perception. And in doing so, they surrender tempo. Explanation shifts power from actor to audience. Once reasons are given, they can be weighed. Once motives are revealed, they can be challenged. Once logic is exposed, it can be reversed. The sheiks refuse this exchange. Instead of entering the narrative space, they widen the gap between action and interpretation. Decisions continue to be made quietly. Outcomes continue to appear without context. Time passed without clarification. This created discomfort because silence forces others to choose between waiting and escalating. And escalation without facts often backfires. As pressure rose, contradictions emerged among critics. Different explanations competed. Consensus fractured. Momentum weakened. Silence became a mirror. Those projecting motives revealed their own priorities. Those demanding explanation exposed their dependence on reaction. This was not accidental. By withholding explanation, power forced others to speak first. And speaking first often means revealing leverage. However, the tension was real. Without explanation, legitimacy can erode. Trust can thin. Allies can hesitate. The sheiks balanced this carefully. They did not replace explanation with nothing. They replaced it with continuity. Operations did not stall. Agreements did not unravel. Results did not reverse. Consistency became the explanation. When outcomes remain stable long enough, questions lose urgency. Curiosity fades. Demand softens. Silence stopped looking like avoidance and started looking like confidence. But the conflict was not over, because there's a final test for any power that refuses to explain. The moment when silence is no longer questioned, but challenged directly. And that moment would determine whether never needing to explain was sustainable strategy or temporary advantage. The climax arrives when silence is no longer treated as absence, but recognized as position. Because at that point, power has successfully removed explanation from the chain of influence entirely. This is where the strategy completes itself. Challenges no longer demand reasons. They test outcomes. Opponents stop asking why decisions were made and start adapting to reality that they were. That shift is decisive. The sheiks did not win by defending their silence. They won by making explanation irrelevant. Outcomes accumulated. Patterns stabilized. Results became familiar, and familiarity neutralized urgency. Once the world adjusted to decisions appearing without justification, the demand for explanation weakened naturally. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reinterpret. Silence became normal. This is a revelation. Power does not need to be understood, to be accepted. It only needs to be consistent. Explanation seeks agreement. Consistency creates inevitability. When outcomes repeat without disruption, they no longer feel imposed. They feel structural. At this stage, explaining would actually weaken authority. It would reopen closed questions. It would invite debate where none remained. So silence persisted, not as defiance, not as secrecy, but as discipline. The resolution is stark. Never needing to explain is not about arrogance. It is about positioning power where language no longer reaches. Because language creates friction, and friction creates leverage. By removing explanation, power removes leverage. The world learned to respond to results instead of narratives, to adapt instead of argue, to move within outcomes rather than attempt to reshape them. That is the final form of this strategy. When power no longer explains, it no longer negotiates its existence. It simply operates. And when operation replaces justification, control becomes quiet, durable, and self-sustaining. This is why the most entrenched power structures often appear silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer need to. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The